If the company was a pressure cooker, I wasn't the flame. I was the safety valve nobody remembered was there, until the day they decided to unscrew me. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that for 6 years, I was the person who kept a mid-sized logistics software company from accidentally setting itself on fire. Not metaphorically, I mean that in the most literal, regulatory, contractually binding sense possible. My official title was Vendor Compliance and Continuity Manager, which sounds like something a bored HR intern invented during a particularly slow Tuesday. In practice, it meant I was the one person in the building who understood every single third-party agreement the company had ever signed, the SLAs, the penalty clauses, the renewal windows, the escalation contacts, the dormant terms buried in appendices that nobody reads until something goes very, very wrong. I had a system, color-coded, cross-referenced, backed up in 3 places because I'd learned early that trusting a single server is how you find out about a data migration gone wrong on a Friday afternoon. I liked the work. I know that sounds strange. Most people's eyes glaze over the moment I say vendor contract management, but there's a particular kind of satisfaction in knowing that you are the reason nothing catastrophic happened today. It's invisible work. The absence of disaster is hard to celebrate. But I knew, and on the hard days, that was enough. Then the CEO's son-in-law joined the company. I'll call him what he was, my new boss's boss. He was brought in as chief operating officer the way you'd bring in a golden retriever to run a nuclear plant, with a lot of enthusiasm, very little relevant experience, and an absolute certainty that enthusiasm was a substitute for competence. He had come from a marketing consultancy, not logistics, not software, not anything remotely adjacent to what we actually did. He had opinions, though. Lord, did he have opinions. His first week, he held an all-hands meeting. He showed up 12 minutes late, set his cold brew on the podium. Who brings a cold brew to an all-hands? And told us the company had been operating in survival mode for too long and it was time to scale with intention. He used the phrase, paradigm-shifting momentum, without irony. I wrote it down. I still have the post-it. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. I scheduled a one-on-one in his second week to walk him through the vendor portfolio, which contracts were up for renewal, which relationships needed attention, which dormant clauses could bite us if we weren't careful. He took exactly 0 notes. He nodded a lot. At the end, he said, "So basically you just maintain spreadsheets?" I said, "I maintain the agreements that keep us operating without penalty exposure. Some of those penalties are in the 7-figure range." He said, right, the way people say it when they're already thinking about something else. I went back to my desk and made a mental note that I was going to have to be very careful. The first sign that careful wasn't going to be enough came 3 months in, when he started restructuring the operations team. Nothing dramatic at first. A few role consolidations, a reorg that shuffled reporting lines. I wasn't touched. I told myself that was a good sign. It was not a good sign. What was actually happening, I would only understand later, was that he was working through a checklist in his head. People he considered essential, people he considered redundant, and people he'd simply never understood the value of because they worked in the margins, in the infrastructure, in the systems that hum quietly and don't announce themselves. I was in that third category. The second sign came when he started hosting what he called efficiency roundtables. These were breakfast meetings, 7 in the morning, where he would list functions by cost center and ask each team lead to justify their headcount. I sat through 3 of them. Each time, I explained what vendor compliance and continuity actually meant in dollars and operational risk. Each time, he'd say something like, "But couldn't this be absorbed into procurement?" Or, "Is this truly a standalone function, or more of a periodic task?" The third time, I brought a 1-page summary showing the 3 vendor penalty events we'd avoided in the past 2 years and the estimated cost of each had they occurred. Combined exposure: $4.2 million. My annual salary, considerably less than that. He looked at the page. He said, "But none of those things actually happened." I said, "Exactly." He blinked. He moved on. I went back to my desk and started documenting things more carefully. Here's the thing about working with contracts for a long time. You start to see them the way a structural engineer sees a building. Most people look at a building and see walls and windows. An engineer sees load-bearing elements, stress points, the things that cannot be removed without consequence. I had spent 6 years building a very specific kind of architecture around this company's vendor relationships. I was named as the primary compliance contact in 11 active agreements. Not because I had manipulated anything, because I was the most qualified person, and because at the time nobody else had wanted the job. Being named as primary compliance contact in those agreements wasn't ceremonial. It meant that if my credentials were ever invalidated or my access to the compliance portal was revoked, the vendors would receive automatic notifications. Some of those notifications were informational. 3 of them were not. 3 of them triggered contractual review windows. 72-hour periods, during which the vendor had the right to suspend service, request audits, or invoke penalty clauses related to continuity of qualified oversight. I had documented this clearly in the handoff protocols I submitted every year. In the risk register, I updated every quarter. In the one-pagers I brought to the efficiency roundtables. None of that mattered, because in the end, he didn't read documentation. He read org charts and headcount numbers. The day it happened was a Wednesday. I remember because I brought a decent lunch, leftover pasta from a recipe I'd been trying to perfect, the kind with the brown butter and crispy sage. I was at my desk eating when my manager appeared in my doorway. My actual manager, not him. She looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth. She said she needed to talk to me. She closed the door. She sat down. She said the word restructuring twice before she got to the actual sentence, which was, my position was being eliminated, effective immediately, and my system access would be deactivated within the hour. I asked if there was a severance package. There was. I asked if there was a severance package. There was. I asked if there was any appeal process. There wasn't. I asked if she knew this was going to create a compliance issue with at least 3 active vendor agreements. She looked at her hands. She said she'd passed along my documentation about that. I asked her whom. She said, him. I said okay. I thanked her. I finished my pasta because it was genuinely very good and it seemed like a shame to waste it. I spent about 30 minutes doing a quiet, methodical handoff of my files to the shared drive. Not because anyone had asked me to, no one had thought to ask, but because I believe in leaving things better than I found them, even when people don't deserve it. Then I submitted my clearance and walked out. I want to be precise about the timeline, because the precision matters. I submitted my clearance at 2:17 p.m. My credentials were deactivated at 2018 p.m. The compliance portal registered the credential invalidation at 2019 p.m. At 2022 p.m., 3 minutes and some seconds after I walked out the door, the first automated notification went out. It went to the account managers at our 3 most critical vendors, per the contractual language I'd helped negotiate. Primary compliance contact credentials invalidated. Continuity review window initiated. 72 hours to confirm qualified successor or service review protocol will engage. I know this because I received a blind copy. Because I had set up my personal email as a secondary notification recipient when I first onboarded the system, something I'd disclosed in writing in my original onboarding documentation, which I strongly suspect no one had read since 2019. I was in the parking lot sitting in my car, eating a granola bar I found in my bag, when my phone buzzed. I looked at the notification. I read it twice. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and sat for a moment. Then I drove home. I want to be clear, I did not set a trap. I did not engineer a crisis. I did not do anything in those final 30 minutes designed to cause harm. What I did was exactly what I had always done: maintain systems correctly, document thoroughly, and follow the protocols that I had spent years building. The notification was automatic. The review window was contractual. The only thing I had done over 6 years was make sure the system worked. And then I left, and the system kept working, exactly as designed, without me. What happened next, I learned from my former colleague, who texted me that evening. At 2:31 p.m., the vendor account manager for our largest logistics integration partner, a contract worth roughly $1.8 million annually and containing a service suspension clause, called the main office number, asking to speak to the compliance contact. The receptionist transferred the call to the operations team. The operations team transferred it to procurement. Procurement didn't know what a continuity review window was. They transferred it to IT. IT definitely didn't know what a continuity review window was. By 3 p.m., the call had looped back to my former manager, who was now sitting at her desk saying, "Let me find out who handles this," into a phone, while simultaneously pulling up my documentation on the shared drive, which was very detailed and very clear, and also made explicit that responding to a continuity review inquiry required someone with active compliance portal credentials and a qualified designation under the agreement, neither of which currently existed at the company. At 3:15 p.m., he was pulled out of what I am told was a very important meeting about their new brand refresh. At 3:22 p.m., someone called my cell phone. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from his assistant, asking if I'd be available for a brief transition conversation at my earliest convenience. I listened to it. I made dinner. I went to bed. The next morning, there were 2 more missed calls and an email from HR, very politely, asking if I would be willing to consult on a time-sensitive vendor continuity matter on a contract basis. The email used the phrase mutually beneficial 4 times. I counted. Here's what they had figured out, and what I had known all along of the 3 vendors in active review windows. One could be resolved with a phone call and updated paperwork. One would take about a week of documentation and portal updates. The third, the largest, the one with the suspension clause, required the named compliance contact to hold a current certification from an industry body. A certification that took roughly 8 weeks to obtain. A certification that I held and that he, definitionally, did not. The 72-hour window was closing. The vendor had already sent a formal notice of pending service review. If no qualified successor was confirmed, the contract would enter a 30-day audit period, during which the company would be billed at a penalty rate of 1.5x their standard fee and required to provide weekly compliance documentation. The estimated cost of the audit period, somewhere north of $200,000. And that was before any of the other 2 vendors escalated. I took 2 days to think about it. I want to be honest about those 2 days because I think people sometimes imagine that moments like this feel triumphant. They don't, or at least this one didn't. Mostly I felt tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years explaining the value of their work to someone who had decided in advance that it wasn't valuable. I wasn't happy that the company was in trouble. I genuinely liked most of the people there. I liked my former manager, even though she'd been the one to deliver the news. I liked the developers on the 3rd floor, who always had birthday cake left out in the break room. I liked the receptionist, who kept a small cactus on her desk and had named it Gerald. None of them had made the decision that put the company in this position. One person had, and he was currently, I assumed, in a very unpleasant series of conversations with people above his pay grade. On the morning of day 3, I called the HR contact back. I said I was willing to help on a consulting basis. I named my rate, which was exactly double my previous daily equivalent, because my time now had market value that had apparently not been visible when I was an employee. I said I was available for a defined engagement of up to 90 days. I said I would not be returning as a full-time employee. There was a pause. The HR contact said she'd need to check with leadership. I said I understood and that I was happy to wait, but that the vendor review window was now in its final 48 hours. So the timeline was what it was. She called back in 40 minutes. They agreed to my rate. They agreed to the terms. The contract was emailed within the hour. I resolved the vendor situation in 11 days. It would have been faster, but I was also working within the limits of what one person can do while also maintaining their own well-being and not burning themselves out on behalf of a company that had fired them 3 weeks prior. I documented everything I did. Every call, every portal update, every piece of paperwork. I left behind a compliance handbook, 112 pages, that any qualified successor could use to maintain the function going forward. I did this not because anyone asked for it, but because that's what professional integrity looks like, even when you're angry, even when you're tired, even when a small part of you would have been completely justified in leaving nothing behind at all. My last day as a consultant, I packed up the temporary desk they'd given me, said goodbye to Gerald, the cactus, and the receptionist who cared for him, and walked out to the parking lot one more time. He didn't come out to say goodbye. I didn't expect him to. A few months later, I heard through the professional grapevine that he'd been moved to a different role. Not fired, moved. Because that's how it goes when you're connected to the right people. But the role was smaller, less operational authority, more of an advisory function where, I'm told, most of his ideas were filtered through people who actually knew what they were doing. I don't know if that counts as justice. It doesn't map neatly onto a before and after. But here's what I do know. The work I did for 6 years mattered. The systems I built held. When they were tested, suddenly under pressure, without warning, they performed exactly as designed. Not because someone was watching. Not because I'd be there to see it. Because that's what it means to build something right. I've thought a lot about why I stayed as long as I did. The honest answer is the same reason most people stay places that don't fully see them. Inertia, health insurance, the hope that things might change, the sunk cost of having given a place your best work. I'm not proud of every calculation I made in those 6 years. There were days I should have pushed back harder. Days I should have made the invisible work more visible, demanded that the documentation be read, insisted that someone in a position of authority actually understand what I was managing. But here's the thing about doing good work quietly. The work doesn't disappear just because no one's paying attention. It accumulates. It runs in the background. And sometimes on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon, while you're walking out of a building you'd given 6 years of your professional life to, it sends a notification. Automated. On schedule. Exactly as designed. I drove home with my windows down that first afternoon. It was a nice day, actually. One of those October days in the mid-Atlantic that feels like an apology from summer. Warm enough that you don't need a jacket. Clear enough that you can see all the way to the ridge line. I stopped and got a coffee. A good one. From the place I only went on days I felt like I deserved it. I sat in the parking lot and drank it slowly and didn't think about anything much at all. That felt like enough. I've told this story a few times now. To friends, mostly, over dinner, when the conversation turns to work and someone asks why I left that job. The short version gets a laugh. The real version takes a little longer. What I keep coming back to isn't the vendor notification or the panicked phone calls or the consulting rate I named with my hands, completely steady. What I keep coming back to is that nothing I did was dramatic. That's the part people don't expect. There was no confrontation in the parking lot, no final speech, no moment where I laid out exactly what was about to happen. I just did the work. For 6 years, I did the work carefully and completely, and when someone decided that careful, invisible work had no value, the work disagreed. That's not luck. It's not coincidence. It's the direct, traceable result of a choice I made every single day to do things right even when no one was watching, to build systems that functioned whether or not I got credit for them, to care about quality in a role that most people couldn't have explained at a dinner party. My former boss's son-in-law made a different kind of choice. He chose to see value only in what was visible, only in what announced itself, only in what fit neatly into a cost center spreadsheet. And that choice had consequences too, just not the ones he anticipated. The thing about dismissing what you don't understand is that the thing you dismissed doesn't stop being real. The contracts were still active, the clauses were still enforceable. The 72-hour window didn't care about his opinion of my function. I think about what it takes to do that kind of quiet work for years without external validation. It's not glamorous. There were mornings I sat in my car in that parking lot before going in and had to remind myself why it mattered. The honest answer, the one I kept coming back to, was simple. Because if I didn't do it right, something would eventually break, and the breaking would be expensive, and people who had nothing to do with the decision-making would be the ones absorbing the cost. That felt like enough of a reason. It still does. What I know now that I maybe only half understood then is that integrity isn't really about other people. It's not a performance. It's not something you maintain so that someday in a parking lot eating a granola bar you can feel vindicated. You maintain it because it's what professional self-respect looks like in practice. The vindication, when it came, wasn't sweet exactly. It was just accurate. The system worked because I had built it to work. That's all. If you've ever been the person in the room whose value was invisible until it suddenly, urgently, wasn't, I don't need to explain this to you. You already know that the work doesn't disappear just because no one's paying attention. It accumulates quietly, does its job, and waits. Builds things worth waiting for.